world stood still as news spread that Pope Francis had passed away.
I think the Pope made an impact on the world, and I think his message of peace and tolerance is one that we could all subscribe to.
At half-mast in honor of Pope Francis, so he was a good man, worked hard, he loved the world, and it's an honor to do that. I want to thank everybody for being here. This is some band. I've heard this band.
The announcement came at daybreak, sending ripples of shock and sorrow through millions of hearts worldwide. On Easter Monday, flags lowered to half-mast, church bells sounded their mournful tones, and a solemn quiet descended upon St. Peter's Square. Thousands of pilgrims who had gathered with hope now stood in quiet contemplation, their candles glowing in the early light. From Rome to distant Burkina Faso, from the Philippines to Brazil, the impact of Pope Francis's leadership was deeply felt. Tributes arrived from across the globe, but one stood out among them all: a heartfelt message from Ibrahim Traoré, the Muslim president of Burkina Faso, whose words captured the universal admiration and grief for the late pontiff. President Traoré's letter wasn't written with ink, but with tears. He expressed how, despite religious differences, Pope Francis's unwavering commitment to peace and justice had profoundly touched the people of Burkina Faso. The Pope's prayers for their nation and its suffering citizens meant more than words could express. In a world divided by conflict, Francis had been a light of hope. Though he never visited their country, he left behind a legacy of peace. His calls for unity, his advocacy for the poor, and his prayers for peace would continue to guide them. This touching letter, penned by President Traoré himself, revealed how a leader molded by hardship and inspired by the vision of a liberated Africa viewed Pope Francis not as a remote religious figure, but as a fellow human being, a kindred spirit.
A lot of things to try and adjust the church to modern time.
Earlier that day, Matteo Brun, the Vatican spokesperson, had delivered the official announcement. Pope Francis had passed away at 6:45 a.m., local time in the Apostolic Palace. The protocols outlined in Universi Dominici Gregis had been initiated. The announcement confirmed what the faithful had feared. The beloved pontiff, who had guided the Catholic Church for 12 significant years, was gone at the age of 88. Messages of grief poured in from every corner of the world. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, head of the College of Cardinals, stepped onto the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square and addressed the assembled crowd in Italian, announcing that their beloved Pope Francis had returned to the Father's house. The crowd, already holding flickering candles from an overnight vigil, stood in stunned silence. A few sobs broke the stillness. Then spontaneously, applause erupted, a gentle, respectful clapping that spread across the square like a wave of gratitude for a life dedicated to service. Above, the great bell of St. Peter's Basilica tolled slowly, its deep sound echoing throughout Rome. In Africa, a continent Pope Francis had visited frequently and held dear, the reaction was intensely personal. He had journeyed to Kenya, Uganda, Central African Republic, Egypt, Morocco, Mozambique, Madagascar, Mauritius, and other nations during his papacy. Each visit was marked by enthusiastic welcomes and emotional farewells. African Catholics often viewed Francis as a champion of the underprivileged and a voice for peace amid conflict. That morning, church bells rang out in places like St. Joseph's Cathedral in Kinshasa and Notre Dame in Côte d'Ivoire. In a small Ugandan village, residents held a Francis from his 2015 visit, placing flowers before it as if honoring a beloved family member. One of the most moving tributes came from Burkina Faso, a West African nation troubled by recent unrest. Its young president, Ibrahim Traoré, had written a remarkable open letter responding to Pope Francis's death. President Traoré, a Muslim by faith, nonetheless admired Pope Francis as a global moral leader. His letter, shared with the press and read aloud on national radio in Burkina Faso, moved many to tears. In his letter, President Traoré wrote with deep emotion, addressing the late pontiff directly. As a Muslim man and leader of a proud African nation, he felt he had lost both a father and a friend. When his people suffered from terrorist attacks on their churches, when drought and hunger afflicted their villages, Pope Francis did not remain silent. The Pope had spoken their names in his prayers at the Vatican and offered consolation from afar. Traoré recalled the telegram Francis had sent after the attack in Dablo in 2019, when innocent worshippers were killed in church. The Pope had called it senseless brutality and prayed for them. Those words had been a balm for their wounds, bringing global attention to the pain of a small country that might otherwise have been overlooked. Traoré also reflected on Francis's courageous visit to the Central African Republic in 2015, when the Pope walked through a land torn by Christian-Muslim conflict. Francis had removed his shoes to enter the mosque in Bangui, embracing the imam as a brother, a powerful demonstration to Africa and the world of what true peace could look like. Though Francis never visited Burkina Faso, his spirit was felt there. He had sent Cardinal Philippe to them with messages of peace and appointed their own humble priest, Cardinal Zunrana, as one of his advisors. Francis always made time for Africa. The president recalled their brief meeting at the Vatican the previous year, when he was a young leader, uncertain and weighed down by his nation's troubles. Pope Francis had taken his hand and said, "Courage, my son. Continue to work for justice and harmony." Those words remained etched in his soul. The Pope might not have remembered him among the many leaders he met, but Traoré would never forget that moment. In their tradition, Traoré explained, when a great elder passes, they don't say they are gone, but that they have returned to Allah, returned to God. He believed Francis had returned to the God he served with his entire being. The Pope's life demonstrated that serving God means serving all humanity, not just those who share one's beliefs. Traoré thanked Pope Francis for loving the poor in Burkina Faso as much as princes and palaces, for defending the dignity of African refugees seeking entry to Europe, reminding the world that we are all one human family. He expressed gratitude for the times Francis mentioned the Sahel region in his prayers and for his consistent calls to end the violence plaguing their area. Though geographically distant, in spirit, Francis stood beside them in their darkest hours. As he joined the world in mourning, Traoré also whispered a prayer that the seeds Francis planted would grow. He hoped the next pope would carry forward Francis's torch of compassion. In Africa, they dared to hope that one day the church might choose a shepherd from their continent, and in God's good time. But regardless of origin, they prayed the new Holy Father would follow the path Francis had paved. A path of simplicity, of bridging divides, of prioritizing the least fortunate. "Rest in peace, humble Father," Traoré wrote. "The winds of the desert carry our farewell to you. In the evenings of our land, when we will remember how you lit up our lives with hope." Francis often ended his letters with fraternally, as a brother to all. Now they bid him farewell as their brother. And may your dream of a more just and fraternal world live on in us. President Traoré's letter, written from the heart of Africa, resonated worldwide. His words, "We have lost a father and a friend," echoed the sentiments of Catholics and non-Catholics alike, who felt Francis was a spiritual father to the world. His hopeful wish that the next pope continue Francis's legacy, and perhaps even come from the global south, reflected the feelings of many. In churches across Africa that day, special masses and prayer services were held not only to mourn Francis, but to pray for divine guidance in choosing his successor. From Nigeria to Nicaragua, Kenya to Korea, similar scenes of mourning unfolded. In Nigeria, a choir gathered outside Lagos Cathedral, singing Francis's favorite hymn, "Make Me a Channel of Your Peace." In war-torn South Sudan, where Francis had journeyed in 2023 on a peace mission, people recalled how he knelt to kiss the feet of their rival leaders, begging them to choose peace. An unprecedented gesture that now brought many to tears as they remembered his humility. In the Philippines and throughout Asia, the outpouring of grief was equally profound. From the Philippines to Nigeria, from Brazil to Italy, the world mourned. People everywhere remembered Pope Francis's dedication to the poor, his relentless advocacy for peace, and his call for global unity. It wasn't just Catholic faithful who wept, but people of all faiths and backgrounds. Pope Francis had truly been a pope for everyone. Just hours before Pope Francis died, inside the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, dawn had broken quietly. Francis had been in fragile health for weeks, fighting a respiratory infection that had worsened after Holy Week. Yet on Easter Sunday, he had found the strength to appear at the window one final time to bless the crowd, determined to share the joy of Christ's resurrection with the world. Few realized it would be his last public appearance. Gently woke the cardinals living nearby. The Pope had requested to hear scripture in his final moments. A young Argentine priest read softly from the Gospel of John, "I am the resurrection and the life." As those words filled the room, Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, took his final breaths. At 6:45 a.m., the heart of the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church ceased to beat. A holy life had ended. Following tradition, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church, was at the Pope's bedside. There was no response, only the soft weeping of those around the bed. "Our Holy Father is gone," Cardinal Farrell said with a breaking voice, as he drew a white veil over Francis's peaceful face. Amid the mourning, the Vatican began preparing for the future. Pope Francis himself often said, "The Church is always in need of newness of life." Now the College of Cardinals faced the task of seeking that newness in a successor. Preparations commenced for the papal funeral and the conclave to follow. In the Apostolic Palace, Cardinal Kevin Farrell met with Vatican officials to discuss the timeline. By tradition, the Pope's funeral should take place between 4 and 6 days after death. The date was set for Friday, April 25, 2025, in St. Peter's Square. Over the next 3 days, Pope Francis's body would lie in state in St. Peter's Basilica to allow the faithful to pay their respects. Millions were expected to come to Rome, just as they had in 2005. Italian authorities prepared for a logistical challenge while recognizing how such an event could unite the world. The chosen resting place reflected Francis's character. He had expressed a desire to be buried in the ground, not in an elevated tomb, customs observed at papal funerals for centuries. The ring of the fisherman, which had been removed and marked with an X earlier as a sign of the end of his authority, would be buried with him, rendered unusable. Meanwhile, the Sistine Chapel closed to visitors as workers began the secret preparations for the conclave. Jamming devices were installed to prevent external communication. Following tradition and security protocols, the floor was covered with carpeting, and the famous stoves that would produce either black or white smoke were tested. Soon, the cardinals in their red robes would take their solemn oath under Michelangelo's frescoes. First, they would gather for daily meetings called general congregations to discuss the church's needs and to become better acquainted, especially those new cardinals Francis had appointed who had never participated in a conclave before. Rome's hotels and seminaries began filling with arriving cardinals from around the world. Cardinal Tuggle from the Philippines, Cardinal Sarah from Guinea, Cardinal Kupich from Chicago, Cardinal Abascal from Spain, Cardinal Onayakan from Nigeria, and many others. A procession of red hats converging on the Eternal City, carrying with them the sorrows and hopes of their people. Many had spoken with Pope Francis just days earlier at an Easter luncheon he had hosted for those who remained in Rome during Holy Week. None expected it to be a farewell. Vatican observers noted a particularly emotional arrival. Cardinal Jorge Ortega from Argentina. He arrived in Rome carrying soil from Francis's beloved homeland to scatter quietly at the Pope's tomb, a symbolic gesture of Argentina's love for their native son. Similarly, Cardinal Dieudonné of the Central African Republic brought a woven tapestry made by women of his country to drape on Francis's coffin, remembering how Francis had visited them during wartime and helped bring peace. This was their final gift of gratitude. Such personal tokens would be discreetly placed during the funeral. Speculation naturally began about who the next pope might be, though all discussions remained respectful given the mourning period. The faithful and the media thoughtfully considered continuity versus change. Would the cardinals choose someone to carry on Francis's progressive legacy? Perhaps another pope from the global south? Names quietly discussed included those of Francis's closest collaborators. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Italy, known for peacemaking. Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana, a prominent African voice and potentially the first African pope in over a millennium. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle of the Philippines, a favorite of Francis with a pastor's heart. Others suggested a more traditional choice to balance Francis's reforms. Perhaps someone from Europe who could dialogue with an increasingly secular world, or another Latin American to continue representing that region. For now, church law prescribed that no official discussions about candidates take place. The cardinals were forbidden from politicking. Instead, they would spend the coming days in prayer and reflection. On the eve of the conclave, they would celebrate the Missa pro eliendo pontifice, the Mass for electing a pope, in St. Peter's Basilica, Peter's invoking the Holy Spirit's guidance. Even as the church looked ahead, many weren't ready to let go of Francis. A group of young people camped in St. Peter's Square held up a banner reading, "Grazie Francesco, rimarrai per sempre." Thank you, Pope Francis. Your memory remains forever. It fluttered in the cool night breeze, illuminated by the floodlights on the basilica's facade. The conclave would come. A new pope would be chosen, but that night belonged to Francis and the love of the people he had served. In Rome, the city Pope Francis had adopted and loved. The atmosphere resembled that of a close friend's funeral on a grand scale. By mid-morning, St. Peter's Square became a sea of people. Despite the somber news, Romans and pilgrims alike felt drawn to the Vatican. The spring air carried the scent of incense as impromptu altars appeared along the Via della Conciliazione, leading to the square. The ancient cobblestones witnessed another historic moment unfolding. The Italian government mobilized with both the Prime Minister and President arriving at the Vatican to pay respects. Alongside cardinals and bishops, Italy's leaders waited in line to pray before Pope Francis's body, which by evening had been moved to the Clementine Hall in a simple casket for one night of private vigils. An honor guard of Swiss guards stood at attention, their heads bowed. Outside, Romans recalled Pope Francis's simple connection with them.
Sentendo risuonare nei nostri cuori l'invito, non dimenticate di pregare per me, ascoltato tante volte da Papa Francesco.
How he would quietly visit the homeless shelter at Termini Station, or how he enjoyed eating gelato incognito among the people until his distinctive walk gave him away. In a touching tribute, the city of Rome projected an image of Pope Francis onto the Colosseum at dusk with the words, Ciao e grazie, goodbye and thank you, in Italian. Drivers passing by slowed down, some making the sign of the cross. In Trastevere, the Sant'Egidio community held a prayer service attended by people of many faiths, reflecting Francis's own interfaith outreach. The chief imam of Rome's mosque and the chief rabbi of Rome both attended, an extraordinary but fitting gesture. Candles illuminated the ancient Pantheon and the Spanish Steps, transformed into impromptu vigil sites. The Eternal City honored the Pope who had constantly reminded it to care for the most vulnerable among us. Pope Francis had gone to rest in God's peace, but his message would continue to live on in the hearts of those who followed his example and in the world he had worked so tirelessly to improve.